In the last video, we took a quick look at brain science and psychology in plain English about the belonging brain and our tendency to want our children to belong, not only us, but other adults. We talked about how rejection actually literally hurts by lighting up the same centers of the brain that feel pain the way that physical pain feels in the body. We also talked about the need for sameness and how it increases protection and therefore safety for our kids, for ourselves, and how all adults, including parents, want to increase that safety and protection for kids, including autistic kids. And all of this leads to therapies and actions and behaviors that try to normalize our children. So today we're going to take it one step further and borrow from some of our colleagues in disability advocacy, deaf advocacy, and other communities that have already tried to take on this idea of normalization so that we can look at tactics and real actions that we can try in our own homes and in our own parenting styles that can help us keep our kids out of this normalization trap and counter those deep-rooted reflexes to try to help our kids be who they really are. So let's dive into it. So this first tactic comes from disability justice, and it's doing barrier audits. Now, if you think about it, if you had a child with a physical disability, it would be pretty clear what we would have to do in our environment. For instance, if they were in a wheelchair, we'd get right to work, creating things like ramps, maybe widening door frames, lowering things like counters and light switches so that they could reach them. But when your child doesn't have that physical disability that makes it a little clearer what things need to be moved or shifted, you have to think a little bit more deeply about how the environment needs to change for your child. Now, some things could be a little more obvious. If your child needs to jump consistently in order to get the sensory feedback, you might get a trampoline like we have in our house. We also have a swing that we hang from a door frame so he can swing anytime he needs. Those are physical things that help him stay regulated. What are some other environmental factors that could be barriers to your child's safety and comfort, or that could be assets that could increase their capacity to care for themselves? For example, when I think about my son's safety and comfort, our dog barks all the time. And that barking could be really jarring and cause, in some cases, meltdowns, considering my son's regulation. If he's already dysregulated and the dog starts to bark unexpectedly, it could send my son into a spiral. So we've had to work really hard on that barrier to safety and comfort. We've had to help my dog understand my son and my son understand my dog. Now, the goal here is to not have to modify my son's behavior to fit my dog. We want our son to be able to be who he is instead of having to change all his behaviors. But sometimes we have to meet each other halfway, right? We can't always bend to our son's needs, and he can't always get his way. There are still cases in which we have to understand when we're being too permissive, something we talked about in Parenting Styles a couple of videos back, and when we need to help set boundaries. So there's a little bit of give and take. There are other things that can be barriers to his comfort and safety and learning. This summer, we understood that the television is actually a big issue for him, not just in terms of his comfort, but in his ability to focus and understand what's happening in his environment. And it's the first time we've observed that the television creates a barrier for him when he's trying to accomplish other tasks around the house. And we've had to remove that barrier by keeping it off most of the day, if not all of the day, throughout the entire summer. So we've constantly been doing audits throughout the summer for his needs, which is something that we haven't had to do in a long time because of his change in schedule. So how can you do audits on a regular basis for the environment for your child, and making sure to keep that updated, because things change as they develop and grow, their needs change, and you have to keep that updated too. So tactic 2 is something that we've learned from deaf culture, and that's thinking of losses as gains. In deaf culture, they think of loss of hearing actually as a gain. So when we think about our children, what are some things that they can't do that actually propose a gain or an asset for us as human beings, or for them as human beings? So when I think about my son, I gave an example in a previous video about how he doesn't make eye contact when he is listening to somebody speak, but he's actually taking it in, and he's taking in a lot of things. My son's hearing is actually exceptional, and it's not just his hearing, it's his perception of sounds. He's not looking at you when you speak, but we have 3 floors in our home. I can be on the top floor while he's on the bottom floor. He's not only hearing what I'm saying right now in my office with the door closed, he's hearing any sounds on the 2nd floor, any sounds in the other rooms on the 3rd floor, anything going on outside, and he can probably give me a full report on every sound he's hearing outside on every floor of the house, anything that's going on. He is not only hearing everything, he is perceiving and inventorying all the sounds that are going on. He is able to discern everything, make note of everything, and understand it all. He can't always communicate what it is, but surprisingly, he will come in and tell me something that he heard an hour ago that I had no idea he had been perceiving from another room, another floor, outside, and catch me completely by surprise. That is an incredible asset that he has, whereas a therapist or a teacher or somebody else would have just been completely focused on the fact that he wasn't making eye contact while speaking to somebody. That is a gain of his autism that somebody would have thought of as a loss of failure to make eye contact. So that's another tactic. How do we think of the gains and focus on those strengths and use those, lean into those as ways of developing what they're capable of? Now, tactic 3 we take from the stuttering community. It's just called train the listener. It really is about helping other people understand the communication style of the person with what we may think of as a perceived deficit. I say perceived deficit because you don't have to call it that or think of it as a deficit, but some people might. So it's about learning how your child communicates and helping other people either have patience if they speak slowly or use a device to communicate. If they speak, but speak with maybe an impediment or they don't always use the correct words, maybe they're Gestalt language processors, so they use scripts. And for instance, my son uses scripts, but he will try using different words in the scripts or different parts of phrases interchangeably until he gets the right ones. And as the listener, I have to give him feedback on whether he's using the right combinations of scripts. And I have to help interpret and tell him, like, that's not right, try this instead. So you train the listener on how your child is speaking and communicating, on whether they need to be patient, on whether they need to give feedback or not, and sometimes you have to help the person not correct. Don't correct, let them keep trying, be patient. And those kinds of tactics. Your child has the opportunity to be who they are, to practice, to learn on their own pace, in their own way, and be authentic. Now, tactic 4 comes from diversity and inclusion literature. It's called minority stress, and it's about creating safety zones. So there may be opportunities, there may be moments where your child really doesn't have the opportunity to be their authentic self, where there isn't somebody who is willing to listen the way that they need to, where they have to practice eye contact, where they're going to be stared at, or they just can't be themselves. And so you create zones and times, opportunities where they can be themselves freely. They have spaces that are quiet. They have spaces with their own toys. They can speak however they can. It is their safety zone. And so that space exists in their house, your house, their room, wherever, and they know they can always go there and be who they are, however they show up. At any time or whatever time you choose. So, for instance, my son has to have all his toys out in a giant mess and see them at the same time. Like, he needs the sensory input, the color, the texture. He needs to be able to see it all. And I need to have a clean space. I can't function if there's a giant mess around me. It creates depression for me. It's really difficult. So it's a tension for us. So I have to have a space for him where he knows that he can go make a disaster and I'm not going to be upset about it and I'm not going to clean it up, and he can be his absolute self. He can create whatever mess he needs to and it's going to be okay. And that's his space, and he can have that space when he wants. And especially if he's had a hard day, during school, when he's gone to school and he has to be around other typical kids and put up with whatever they do, if they bully him, if they look at him funny, and he has to be there. He can come home and make his mess in his space, and I'm not going to do anything about it. He has that space. So you create safety zones like that for him. That is for your child. That's the tactic. Okay, so through the magic of editing, you all have no idea that it has been many hours and a whole day of autism parenting craziness. But I promised 2 more tactics, so I want to at least provide those because I do think they're really important. And as I said, I have several others, so let me know if you want me to cover a few more in another video. But tactic number 6, this one is focused on trauma-informed literature, and it talks about 2 important things. One is predictability, which we know in the autism world is also really important. And the other is choice, which we also focus on in the autism world. So these 2 tactics or 2 strategies within tactic 6 lend themselves really nicely to the autism world already. Predictability is, from the trauma literature, really important for letting someone who has been through abuse, and we can talk about it as physical abuse, emotional abuse, even coming from war-torn countries, any kind of trauma. It's really important for a sense of safety to know what to expect from a situation. That's why predictability is important. It is also important to have choice from a sense of autonomy. Knowing that you have control of your decisions of what happens to you is very important from a trauma-informed perspective. And those 2 things are very important for an autistic person or a neurodivergent person as well. So from our point of view, when we're dealing with neurodivergent people, we want to have things like visual schedules, which are common to our world already. I talked a lot in a post on Instagram, in a blog post I did, about how important it turned out to be for my son to create visual schedules, even though I thought that as he became more verbal, we could phase out visual schedules, he still really needed that sense of security that it provided to be able to both have the verbal cues and have the visual cues to be able to feel safe in what was going to happen with his day, with his month, with his week. It's also important to have other types of visual cues like timers, to have social stories that let him know what is going to happen in important events like going to a new kind of doctor's visit or medical appointment, going to a new kind of event like the beach for the first time. And there are all kinds of ways that we can provide a sense of predictability. So it could be social stories, it could be television shows or movies, it could be going to tour a facility or a location for a first time before actually going to it to engage in the activity that's going to happen there. It could be lots of different versions of those types of things. When we talk about choice, we can talk about things like letting them choose what clothes they're going to wear, what toys they're going to take, the kind of transportation you're going to take there, if they want a parent to go with them or a particular caregiver, the day they want to go on, within reason and within what's available, be able to provide those choices for them. The last one that I want to talk about comes from the space of being culturally responsive, and it is also really important for our space because it revolves around shared communication responsibilities. So I spoke earlier, and I think it was tactic 3 or 4, about educating listeners on how an autistic or neurodivergent person may communicate and how a listener has responsibility in their way of understanding communication preferences or capacity. And when it comes to the space of being culturally responsive, there are lots of ways that misunderstandings can occur. Sometimes around language, right? If a person speaks Spanish, for instance, and somebody else speaks French, and they're trying to communicate across languages, maybe somebody speaking Spanish, learning French as a second language, is trying to communicate with a native French speaker and isn't saying things exactly the way that a native French speaker would anticipate. Miscommunication can occur, right? The same thing can happen with somebody using a communication device like an AAC device, speaking with somebody who's a native language speaker using vocal language, not entirely understanding what is meant when somebody is using an AAC device. And there is shared responsibility over any miscommunication that occur. I think there's a tendency to privilege somebody who speaks using their voice and maybe assume that the miscommunication is the fault of the person using a communication device. But if we're being responsive from tactic number 7, then we would say that that is both the parties' responsibility to share in the miscommunication and both the parties' responsibility to work toward understanding each other. And that is also a very important tactic in teaching people in the autistic person's sphere on how to own their part of the communication responsibility. So this could be other siblings and family members, other therapists and doctors, and also your child, to the extent that you can communicate with them about how they can be more clear, how they can be a little bit more receptive to miscommunication, and how they can work to better communicate. So for instance, my son is a Gestalt language processor, and he will speak by using He uses scripts, but he will also independently use different language. It's not just scripts, but they're little phrases that he has picked up in different ways. They're not just from movies and not just from shows, but almost sentence fragments that he understands mean something, but he doesn't always use them correctly. And he will try them, and I won't understand what he's trying to say. So he'll start to give me context clues. Instead of getting frustrated, which he would in the past, he understands that mommy's not getting it and that he has some responsibility in trying to help me understand him. So he will start to use context clues, like he'll start to give me a color. If he's trying to tell me about a toy and I don't understand what toy he's telling me about because he's not using the exact name of the toy, he'll start to tell me a color. He'll start to tell me things from the same family. Like if it's an animal, he'll start to say cat, or he'll start to say cheetah, or he'll start to say panther, and then I'll get that it is something from a cat family, and then I'll start to give other names until I guess the right one, and then we'll start looking for the stuffed animal that he's talking about. So he helps me and understands his role in communicating more clearly. And I understand my role in trying to work with his clues and his context clues to understand him better. But I don't correct him. I don't tell him, you're not using the right words, or you're not saying it right. And together we have a way of working so we don't get frustrated with each other and understanding each other a little bit better so that we finally get to the right answer. And then in the future, once we find it, I'll give him the name and he'll repeat it. And in the future, he'll know what word that is and use it. So those were 7 tactics that help us create a space that isn't changing our child's behaviors to match the worlds that we've created without them having a say in it, but that teach other people to better interact with our children, or that help us shape the environment in ways that better fit our children's needs, and that also help us collaborate with our child and help our child collaborate with us and the environment, so that together we're creating the spaces that better function for everyone. And I think that that is a way that feels proactive, that works against the tendency to normalize their behaviors, that honors and respects who they are and how they function. But that works with the understanding that there is a deep-seated biological, psychological tendency to normalize, to socialize our children, to be accepted, and to erase behaviors that may be considered socially weird or different. It's not coming from a place of cruelty. And we can work against it without feeling angry, without feeling offended, without feeling that immense need to protect our children, but to actually educate ourselves and others about why that need exists and how we can work past it and through it to actually respect our children in a way that's productive and active, and that draws from communities that have already been doing this work for a long time and that have created strategies that actually make sense for our children too. I hope that this was helpful. There are other ways we can keep talking about this. So if you're interested and you want to keep these kinds of conversations going, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you again next Thursday when another video drops. See you soon. Bye.